Hi, this is Don Farber with VineyardSoft Corporation, and I'd like to welcome you to this training session on the KnowledgeSync solution. The topic for this training session will be the configuration of an event's actions or workflow. And in fact, this is the second of 5 training sessions on the configuration of event actions and workflow. The specific subject discussed during this training session will be the use of the Submit SQL tab within an event's actions. And so, let's continue our work in our ERP application, and we're going to take a look at an event that identifies and responds to overdue invoices within our ERP application. Now this event, like all events, has an associated query. This query not only identifies the conditions that this event is going to check for, but also identifies those fields of data about the overdue invoices that we'll be able to utilize in the actions that we're configuring. It's important to note that as you go about configuring your actions, if you need access to a field of information regarding the triggered records, and that field is not available for you, you simply need to go back into the query associated with that event, add the necessary fields as columns to that query, and then your actions or workflow will also have access to that data. Now let's skip ahead to the Actions tab, and as mentioned, the action we're going to focus on for this session will be the one called Submit SQL. Now before we talk about the configuration of the options within this tab, it's worth making the following very important note. And that is that if you are configuring an event to execute actions via the Submit SQL tab, typically you're going to want those actions to be executed once on each record that meets this event's criteria. Using this event as our example, if this event finds that there are 10 overdue invoices that match this event's criteria, any options that you specify in the Submit SQL tab, such as executing a SQL insert or update statement or executing a stored procedure, typically you would want them to execute once for each of those 10 invoices. As such, you need to be 100% certain that this event does not make use of begin repeat and end repeat anywhere in the event. Those commands typically are going to appear within the alert message configuration options, those being the email, fax, page, webcast, and IM tabs. If you do make use of begin repeat and end repeat in an event, KnowledgeSync loses the ability to execute a separate action on each record that meets the event's criteria. Thus, once again, if you're going to be executing actions like SQL statements or stored procedures in response to an event's conditions, make sure that that event does not make use of begin repeat and end repeat. Now let's talk about the Submit SQL tab. From this tab you can really do 3 things. Number 1, you can add records to one or more underlying databases through the use of SQL insert statements. Secondly, using SQL update statements, you can update the values of one or more records that are within an underlying database. And thirdly, from this tab, you can execute stored procedures. In our examples here, we have 2 actions to submit SQL actions associated with this event. The first is an update statement, a SQL update statement, and the second of these actions is the execution of a stored procedure. Now, when you are configuring an event to execute actions from the Submit SQL tab, the first thing that you need to do is select the ODBC source that connects to the underlying database that KnowledgeSync is going to be updating or adding records to. You can either choose from an existing list of connections or ODBC sources as they've been defined in the KnowledgeSync application, or you can click on the New Connection button to create a new connection to an underlying database that you wish to update. After you specify the connection information, you're then able to specify the SQL syntax or the stored procedure syntax that you want KnowledgeSync to execute. And although you can directly type syntax into the fields that you see in front of you, You can also make use of a SQL editor window, which makes your editing much more flexible. And so, by clicking on the list button that appears here, we'll get taken into our SQL statement editor. Now, the SQL statement editor consists of a number of different components. Up at the top left, you have the ability to display a list of SQL tables and the columns within them for the database whose connection you have just referenced. And so, we could, for example, display a list of all of the fields of data within our account table. And we can then use these individual fields or columns in our SQL syntax or the stored procedure that's going to be executed. Over on the right-hand side at the top of this window is a list of all of the fields of data from the query that's associated with this event. These are all the fields of data that we can use within our SQL insert statement, update statement, or for that matter, within our stored procedure. And once again, if you find that you need to reference fields of data that are not shown in this list, you'll simply need to go back into the query associated with this event and add the corresponding fields as columns in the query, and then those fields will appear from this list. Notice also that this list gives you the ability to utilize date variables as well as those fields of data that are being drawn from the corresponding query. In the middle of this window, KnowledgeSync gives you access to a few additional helpful tools. That includes the sample SQL syntax for inserting or adding a record to an application database. And in fact, there are two methods for doing so. You can review both of those methods and use the one that you're most comfortable with. Now, it's important to note that this SQL statement editor is not designed to teach people who don't know how to write SQL statements to write SQL statements. Rather, this editor is designed as a helpful tool to aid people who are already familiar with SQL syntax. We do not recommend that this option be used by those folks who are not familiar with writing SQL insert or update statements, and as such, we recommend setting KnowledgeSync's authorizations to make sure that only people who are familiar with writing this kind of syntax have access to this option. In addition to the two different formatting methods for creating SQL insert statements, there is likewise an option for sample syntax if you wish to perform a SQL update statement to update information in an existing database record. And in fact, it is that sample update syntax that we're utilizing here within our SQL statement editor. Here we are telling KnowledgeSync to update the account table, and we're telling KnowledgeSync specifically to set the value of the account status equal to hold. But please note, very importantly, that KnowledgeSync does require the use of a where clause in all of your SQL statements that are performing updates, as this is what tells KnowledgeSync which record in the underlying database to update. In this case, we're simply telling KnowledgeSync to look into the field called customer number, locate the corresponding account record using the account ID field within our underlying database, thus locating the one and only record that should be correctly updated. If you create a SQL update statement without a where clause, KnowledgeSync will perform that update on every record in the underlying table. Now, under the sample SQL statements is also a list of helpful functions and formulas that you can utilize within your SQL syntax. And those include a number of date calculation syntax expressions that you can utilize, as well as other handy SQL functions. Once you have formatted your SQL statement as desired, you can select the OK button down at the bottom left of this window. Now, you'll notice that we actually have two actions selected within the Submit SQL tab. The first is our SQL update statement, and the second is an example of how this tab can also be used to execute stored procedures. And just like your SQL statements, the stored procedures themselves also have access to the fields of information from the corresponding query. And again, keep in mind that KnowledgeSync is going to execute, in this case, each of these commands once for each record that meets this event's criteria. Now, before we wrap up this training session, let's just scroll our window to the right because there's one other option that you have. And that is, If this event is also executing one or more reports from back on the Reports tab, you have the option to specify whether you want your SQL statements or your stored procedures to wait on their execution until the reports are complete. And that is an option that you can enable or disable based upon each Submit SQL action that you select for a given event. Okay, with that, let's click on Save and Close to save our work, return to our main Event Manager window, and that wraps up this training session on configuring SQL statements, insert and update statements, as well as stored procedures for a KnowledgeSync event, typically used to add or update information within one or more application databases. So with that, I'll thank you very much for your time and attention today, and I look forward to speaking with you in a future KnowledgeSync training session. Thanks very much.